Today on Energy Contact, do your molecules get moody? Can they get angry or happy or sad or lusty? Well, absolutely they do. They're always in some mood or another, and that's precisely the reason that you are always in some mood or another. In fact, it's the reason that mind-altering drug works, the legal ones and the other ones. Want to find out how your molecules are making you feel? Well, make a bond with the television set, because it's coming up right now on Energy Contact.
And I ain't gonna worry, and I ain't gonna complain. I'm gonna drive away all these doubts I've been keeping, and I'll keep my mind on better things. I ain't gonna worry, and I ain't gonna complain. I'm gonna drive away all these doubts I've been keeping, and I'll keep my mind on better things. Just keep my mind on better things.
Hello, and welcome to Energy Contact. My name is Joseph Willenbrink. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you to the production staff here in the studio for helping me get my message out to you. Energy Contact is a series I'm presenting as a public service. It's about attaining perfect health, growth, self-improvement, happiness, and realizing your full potential. It's designed to present you a new way of seeing yourself and seeing the world around you. We're talking on this series about things that have to do with making an energetic contact with yourself internally and with your environment. There's no difference between the body, the mind, the spirit, the emotion, the intellect, and the ego. There's no difference between mass and energy. Goodness, we love to categorize and classify. We like to separate things out. But the more we look, the more we find that there's absolutely no difference. So all that health and growth and self-improvement take place at the interface, where we take that unseen energetic stuff and bring it into contact, into energy contact with our physical selves. We're presenting on this program a brand new paradigm that is thousands and thousands of years old. We're presenting extraordinary topics for ordinary people. And let's move forward with that now and straight away bring up that first slide. Everyone, please know that I'm not a doctor. I don't want to be one. This show is in no way a medical advice, and I don't give medical advice. I might call myself an energy healer or a chakra healer. So might a lot of other people. So might you. But please understand that state, federal, and local governments absolutely do not. There's a lot of important information on your screen right now. We're going to leave that up for a second. Please read it with awareness. And when you've got it down, if you would, please locate a pencil and paper. Here's why. At the end of this show, we're going to run some credits. And on those credits, there's going to be contact information from me. I invite you to contact me. I hope you will. I will get back to you. And there is plenty of time when the credits roll for you to jot down my phone number, my email address. But there's not enough time to get up and start looking for your pencil and paper. So if you'll get that handy now, you'll be ready when the time comes. Today's show is show number 32. If you're joining me for the first time today, thank you. Thank you and welcome. These shows are sequential. They do build. We're talking about things today that we've introduced in previous shows, we've explained in previous shows. So there's a little ramp-up time, a little stuff that you might have missed out on, but I'm doing my very, very best to make these shows complete and full on a standalone basis. So I think you'll get a lot out of today's show, and hopefully you'll find it not only informative but entertaining as well. And if it is your first time, or one of your first time, and if what you see piques your interest, then I'll invite you to look around. There will be previous shows airing later, either here in this cable area or perhaps in the different cable areas of your friends. If you'll look for them, I'll appreciate it. All right, and now it's with great pride and honor that I introduce my co-host to you. We're going to bring Slim on. Slim is the brains of this outfit. Slim is here to help us understand a little bit about our physical selves. This show is a show about energy. Energy is important. We want to understand energy. But energy by itself does us no good, really. We need to understand what it is that the energy contacts, the anatomy of it all. Well, Slim's here to help us understand that. Remember, A body without energy is nothing but a corpse. And energy without a body, it's a number of cool things, but none of them are human. Slim's here to help us understand the anatomical side of energy contact. All right, let's move ahead. Previously on Energy Contact, we have been discussing the body intellect and the anatomy that it builds. We've seen how the same materials in our brains that give us thought, reason, memory, recall, logic, all those things we think of as brain things, how they are in fact in every cell of our body. We've seen how thought builds anatomy, how that body intellect builds us. And recently, over the past few shows, we've been seeing how that relates to our nervous systems. We've been looking at our nervous systems. Until the last show, we've been looking at our nervous system sort of at a structural level, anatomical, the gears, the bells, and the whistles, things like that, the brick and mortar. Last show, we started to move ahead from that. But previously, we've seen things like axons and neurons and synapses, and we've talked about those things. If you weren't here, don't worry, we'll cover those terms again. We also saw when we were looking at this nervous system that we have a completely separate, completely viable, completely independent brain in our core, in our guts, in our viscera. It's called the enteric brain. It's been there for millennia, since long before we were humans. And the best scientific minds didn't have a clue about it until the 1970s. Old yogic mystics and people like that have known about it forever. We've also spoken just a little bit about that mysterious energy that those old Indian mystics called Kundalini energy. All right, well today, and over the next couple shows, we're having a little bit more fun with all of this. We're laying the groundwork for what's going to be a very esoteric awareness of ourselves. It used to be believed that this nervous system was sort of this dry electrical system. It was all electrical signals and things like that. Very different than the gooey chemistries of our glandular systems and our immune systems and such. Now, just over the past few years, we're learning different. Science is discovering that all of these systems are pretty much the same, which is leading us to a new understanding. Today we're going to talk about a lot of anatomy and a lot of chemistry. But remember, our goal isn't to understand anatomy and chemistry. We want to understand what energy contacts in the physical self. What makes us, what makes you and me something other than a corpse. So, we're rediscovering a long-forgotten nervous system. We're going to look at it more today, and we're going to look a little more at perhaps what it has to do with that equally long-forgotten enteric brain we've been talking about. Today we're going to talk about peptides, ligands, receptors, proteins, things like that. And if you don't know what some of those terms are, hang on, we'll cover them. Later, we're going to see that all of this has something to do with this Kundalini energy we've been alluding to. All right, plenty of work to do today, lofty goals. But before we start, now's the time for you to close your eyes and take a deep breath, because now is the part of our show where we get to visualize. We're going to take a little journey in our mind's eye. Today, we're going to go back in space and time and reality, and we're going to be the witnesses of an unfolding fairy tale. Imagine that you and I find ourselves locked up in the very top room of a very tall tower back in the days of old. And as we look around over in the corner, we see that there's a beautiful princess sleeping. And she is asleep, but she's also tossing and turning. We can tell she's distraught. She's distressed a little bit. And about that time, all of a sudden, we hear some rustling. And over by the window, we look out, and up through the window pops this brave, mighty, handsome prince. He scaled the wall. And as he hops into the room, sort of with a dramatic flair, he turns around, he walks over to that princess, he leans over, and he kisses her. Sweet, huh? Well, guess again. Right about that time, that princess wakes up, she opens her eyes, she gazes upon him, and she shrieks. Ah! She says, "You aren't my brave and handsome prince." And the prince, he's taken aback. And he replies, "Well, you know, I am brave, and I am handsome. And for that matter, I am a prince. But I must not be your brave, handsome prince, because you are not my beautiful princess." She looks back at him and she says, "Well, I am beautiful, and I am a princess, but I'm not your beautiful princess. And so he just heads back out to the window. And as he walks out and gets ready to scale the wall back down a little bit, we decide to follow him and look outside. And when we do, we see outside this window, there are a billion towers like this, all identical. We look up the side of them, each of them has a couple of handsome princes scaling the wall. And up in the rooms at the top, each of them has a sleeping princess. And we start to think, this is going to be a project. How are we going to match up all of these beautiful princesses, each with her correct and corresponding handsome prince? All right, hold on to that thought for a second. Now it's time to do a little bit of review. And to do that review, we're going to go back even further in time than this. Back before there were princes and princesses, before there were humans or apes or even mammals for that matter, be they real or imagined. We're going back in time on Earth before there were creatures with spines. We think of our pre-vertebrate ancestors as primitive little creatures, but they are our ancestors. Pre-vertebrate, by the way, means before the development of spines, before the development of backbones. Therefore, these creatures had no central nervous systems and no brains, at least brains as you have thought of them in the past. Before these evolutionary predecessors had intellect as we know it, though, they had these gut-based and enteric brains. And long before they had the nervous systems with the axons and the dendrites and the synapses and the neurotransmitters and such, they had receptors. And each of those receptors had its own dedicated ligand. We're going to explain these terms in a moment. Hang on. All right, because over the past few weeks we've been making a big deal about this gut brain. We've been making a big deal about this new nervous system. You know, your doctor isn't making a big deal about it. Science textbooks, they're not making a big deal about it. So what's the big deal? Well, remember, modern science didn't even know that humans, or any mammals for that matter, even had a second brain and a second nervous system until the 1970s. And when they did figure it out, they just sort of thought that this brain and nervous system were obsolete, that they were existing but functionally useless, like an appendix or something, just kind of hanging around, replaced by newer brains and better nerves. But now we're beginning to understand that these things weren't just sitting there over the millennia, just enjoying their uselessness. They were evolving too. And so we see now that they're doing something, and that without them, maybe you and I are just a corpse. So we have the classic model of the nervous system, this dry electrical system. And only over the past few decades have we even stopped to learn that over 90%, close to 95% of our transmitters and receivers inside our system, they're not electronically jumping across synapses at all. They're more chemical than electric. They are the internal forces that animate us. Let's look at this from another angle, and we'll review some of these terms I've been throwing around here. Let's bring up our first slide. Our first slide that we're going to show here is the classical neuron and the classical synapse. That neuron there on the left of your screen is that little creature. He has dendrites, that's his hair, and those are the sensors, the receivers of messages from the outside into the central nervous system. And that body down below, that little skinny body, that's an axon. Axons are the stem, and they're the transmitters of messages from the central nervous system. That little polka-dotted face up there, that's the cell body itself. That's the cell. That little eyeball there, that's the nucleus of the cell. All right, on the right side of the screen there is the classical view of the synapse. It looks like almost like an animal's paw on a tree branch there or something, huh? Well, that picture there is across that synapse, they're sending things called the neurotransmitters. The synaptic cleft is just that tiny space between the cells, between that pink animal paw and that blue dendrite there. The neurotransmitter is the electrochemical message that's being set, or at least the signal that contains the message. Let's go right to the next slide. And you can see how these millions and millions of neurons in our body are intermingled. Here, what you see is how the dendrites and the axons sort of relate to each other. And even though in our body, each neuron, each cell is completely independent and they don't work in teams, you can imagine a few billion of these things sort of waving around, bumping around, waving like tree branches, touching and tapping, tickling each other, sending and receiving signals 24/7. We've mentioned the terms ligand and receptor. Well, these neurotransmitters we've talked about are ligands. And the word ligand means something that joins or something that binds. This classical model is totally accurate, but it's vastly incomplete. Something like 90% of ligand receptor relationships are not like this at all. And we didn't know about it until the 1970s. All right, let's come back up here. And we're going to take a step back for a second and learn a little more chemistry. Got a lot of terms to cover here. Hang on with me, we're going somewhere. Ligands, receptors, neurotransmitter, these things are all molecules. Molecules are composed of atoms. They're a combination of atoms. Longtime viewers of Energy Contact will recall that way back in the first shows, we discussed how all atoms of the same type are exactly the same. In other words, you and I are composed mostly of carbons and hydrogens. The gasoline in your gas tank is composed mostly of carbons and hydrogens. The carbons and hydrogens in your gas tank are exactly the same as the carbons and hydrogens in you. Completely identical, completely interchangeable. There's no difference. So what is it that makes us different than a puddle of gasoline? Or different than hundreds of other things that you see every day that I could use as an example? Well, it's the arrangement. It's the way those molecules are arranged. And molecules are arranged, can be arranged in strings and clusters and chains and rings and all sorts of things like that. There's just hundreds of ways they're arranged. That's where the differences come from. Most of the molecules that we encounter, or many of the molecules that we encounter in our life, are very simple. So if you think for example of water, H2O, it's a molecule with 3 atoms, 2 H's and an O. So when energy is applied to ice, the molecules, the atoms sort of vibrate and they turn into water, and more energy is applied and they turn into steam. All right, as mentioned, we're going through a lot of information here, but we are coming back, I promise you, to what this has to do with the way we feel, what this has to do when we have feelings that we don't understand in ourselves. Well, we're about to understand them, but we're going to dive into just a little bit more chemistry here. You've heard of proteins. Well, proteins are molecules. Relative to H2O and CO2 and simple molecules like that, protein molecules are huge. They don't have 3 atoms, they have tens of thousands, tens and tens of thousands of atoms sometimes. Proteins are made up of other molecules called amino acids. You've heard of amino acids too. And the reason that you sort of hear that amino acids in your diet are good things is because they are the building blocks of proteins. When your body builds proteins, it takes this amino acid here and this here, and it sort of assembles them like in a factory somewhere. There's a third word to know in this family, and that word's peptides. Peptides you can think as sort of intermediates between the two. Peptides are chains of amino acids too, but they're smaller than proteins. They're shorter than proteins. And so you've got sort of a continuum here. Huh? You've got the little atoms and then molecules. Well, a reasonably big molecule is an amino acid. And then you string those together and you have peptides. And then you string those peptides together and you've got proteins. Okay, where are we going with all this? Well, let's think of some peptide names with which you might be familiar. They tend to be pretty anatomical molecules. Endorphins, serotonin, aspartame, opiates. These are all peptides. What those slides we looked at a minute ago didn't show is that on the axons we have a bunch of receptors. What do receptors and peptides have to do with each other? Okay, well these receptors They are big molecules. They're big specialized proteins. And as we move and breathe, energy flows through them. I'm going to take a second here and show you, I brought a protein with me. Proteins in your body look a little bit like this. This is a chain of beads, and that's sort of how proteins look. And they do, I'm moving it around on purpose. They do sort of move around like this, and they wave around. You might be able to see that my protein's a little threadbare there in the middle. That's not by design. That's because I'm on a cable access budget. But this protein here, is tons of these things are just wiggling around in your body, hanging out. And so receptors look like this, and these things are tiny because there's millions of these on each axon of each neuron, which itself is a single cell. Okay, so each neuron has millions of these things, and your body has billions and billions of neurons. So do the math, we got plenty of them. Okay, I'm going to put my protein down for a second here. These proteins, in this case, are receptors. They're sensors. And so energy applied to a little H2O molecule that melts the ice and turns it into steam, these big molecules aren't going to melt like that. So what do they do when energy is applied? Well, they wiggle about, and they start doing this sort of sleek and sexy, alluring, inviting, and even seductive dance. And they're doing that while they're just sort of wistfully floating around on the surface of these dendrites and axons, and as they do that, they've got roots that are going deep into the middle of the cell. Well, why is it that a protein, that a receptor molecule, would work so hard to be sexy? Why would a molecule want to dance around in such a provocative way? Well, because it's flirting, and it's flirting in very blatant and direct ways. It's a mating call. It's like a dime store romance novel, and it's going on all over the place inside your body right now. This mating dance of this receptor is designed to attract the ligand. Ligands are peptides. Remember, bigger than amino acids, smaller than proteins. And the ligands are the handsome princes in our story. They're suitors. But to the receptor, only the right ligand will do. That receptor gives a very cold shoulder to every handsome ligand that drifts by until Mr. Right shows up. Okay, so we're building a new model now of the nervous system. Let's bring up another slide. We'll show you some new pictures here. All of a sudden, our imagery is becoming less like a schematic or a blueprint, and it's getting a little more trippy, isn't it? The ligand and the receptor are the mass, but because there's no difference between mass and energy, it's hard to chronicle accurately what's going on. It's hard to draw a picture of energy. That blue ribbonish thing wrapped around there like a nest, that is a representation of the receptor. It's a protein. And those little bubbles nesting in there, cuddling in there if you will, those are ligands. That ligand is coming up and embracing the receptor, and it enters it like a key enters a lock. Let's go to the next slide. And you can sort of see how they nest in here a little bit. There it is. So the receptor there is the orange stuff, and that ligand is all those little lattice works in there. And it's nestling in. And all of that causes motion. And that motion causes that ligand to bump on and bump off. And it keeps bumping in and falling off again. And all of that causes that receptor there to contort and morph and writhe about even more, changing its shape until there's this sort of optimal configurational crescendo. And then, snap, information enters the receptor, and then past the receptor, and right into the core of the cell. And that information changes the cell. Phew, all right, let's come back. That information changes the very nature of the cell in very dramatic way. In fact, when that information changes the cell, that then changes the whole organism. What's an organism? Well, it's you. It's you and me. Information is the seed. What is that information? Is it an atom, a molecule, a tiny little bit of matter? No, no. It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. At least nothing we can see. It's energy, and it's making energy contact. When that ligand and receptor bind, a biochemical chain reaction commences. And the ligand is still orchestrating the event. So what is that cell doing as a result of all this? Well, it's doing any one of a number of things. It might be making new proteins. It might be changing the way that your cells divide, opening or closing ion channels, adding, subtracting, multiplying, modifying the cells themselves, just to name a few things. To put it another way, the very essence of the cell is determined by what the receptors are doing on its surface and whether or not they are occupied by ligands. And all this changes the way you feel. This whole receptor ligand thing is the molecular information technology infrastructure of our nervous system and beyond. These micro changes are a big deal. They translate into large changes in health, behavior, energy levels, states of euphoria, peace, distress, anger, every single emotion that you have, mood and demeanor in general. So what orchestrates these meetings? Who's the matchmaker between these ligands and these receptors that are causing all that? Well, it's those internal forces that animate you, and it's those outside forces that are acting upon you. Again, those things that we discussed in the very first episodes of Energy Contact. Everything, air, food, water, the kisses and hugs, the hurts, the bumps and bruises, all the things of life, are all causing little changes at microscopic levels, which cause the big changes at the macroscopic levels, which in turn leads back to little changes at the microscopic levels again. And those changes rule us. And they rule the next set of events, the next set of chain reactions. When we understand a little bit about what's going on with all this, then we begin to understand our feelings and our motivations. And we see how we make ourselves sick, and then how to make ourselves well, or how we make ourselves asymmetrical, and we learn how to make ourselves even, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. But you'll recall from the last show that the same time that scientists, that neurologists were discovering these chemicals in the nervous system, they thought they were nervous system chemicals. But they were also being studied by endocrinologists who saw them as gland chemicals. And they were also being studied by immunologists who saw them as immune system chemicals, and gastroenterologists who saw them as intestinal and digestive signals. So all this is earth-shaking. We've been trying to separate things, but we're seeing that these roads are converging into one point, making energy contact at one point. We'll leave it there for today. Get out your pencil. I wish you peace and positive energy and a healthy life in energy contact.